I always thought I was a decent guy. Not perfect, of course, but who wouldn't be? I didn't consider myself one of those people who yells out the window of a truck. Build the wall. I wasn't one. I knew black people. I worked with them a lot. So imagine my surprise when it turned out that I had been one of them all along. I had a bad situation at the bank. I was third in line. The air conditioning was not working, the teller was moving as if underwater, and the guy at the front of the line was stalling. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a gray suit so sharp it made me feel underdressed in my polo. Black guy. Clean-shaven. Calm. Way too calm for someone holding up the line for 30 minutes. He was talking to the teller, something about opening a business account, and every time she typed something in, he'd correct her with this polite tone like he was the damn manager. I checked my watch 3 times in 5 minutes. Then I started huffing a little. You know, the exaggerated sighs. The shifting feet. The passive-aggressive show. Nothing. He didn't turn around. Didn't flinch. Just kept talking to the teller like we weren't all waiting. That pissed me off more than it should have. I wish I could tell you I don't know why, but I do. Something in me, something ugly, something small, wanted to remind him. I leaned into the guy behind me and muttered, "Christ. What is this, jungle protocol now?" He didn't laugh. But the guy in the suit turned. Slowly. He looked right at me. Not mad. Not sad. Just, tired. Like he'd been here before, heard this all before, and couldn't even summon the energy to react. That look? It cut deeper than any punch. But I didn't stop. I couldn't help myself. That's the worst part. I doubled down. You people always act like you own the place, I added. Why don't you go open a treehouse in the rainforest or whatever? Dead silence. Even the teller froze. The man didn't say a word. Just nodded once, a tiny, painful, almost imperceptible nod, and stepped away from the counter. He took his papers, his folder, and walked right out of the bank without finishing what he came for. No yelling. No comeback. No scene. He left me standing there with the whole lobby watching me like I just pissed on the American flag. The teller called me next, but I couldn't look her in the eye. I don't even remember what I came in for. On the drive home, I told myself he was being overly sensitive. That I'd had a bad day. That I was just making a joke. That maybe he was being slow on purpose, or that he thought he was better than the rest of us. But the truth followed me like a bad smell. Something inside me had cracked open that day, and the worst part was, I didn't even feel bad enough to apologize. Not really. Not then. Not until the accident. 2 weeks passed. I didn't think much more about the bank. Not consciously, anyway. Life had its usual rhythm, early alarms, burnt toast, and my son, Jake, always taking too long in the damn bathroom. Football practice, school stress, and me reminding him to check his oil like every dad is legally required to do. But every now and then, late at night, I'd think about that man's eyes. That calm. That silence. The way he just left. And then I'd shake it off. I'd go to bed. I had more important things to worry about. Like Jake's SATs. College was creeping up fast, and between his grades and my wallet, it felt like we were both hanging by a thread. It was a Saturday when the phone rang. 4:17 p.m. I was standing in the yard, dragging a bag of fertilizer across a patch of grass that refused to grow, when my wife came running out, phone to her ear, her face white. "Jake's been in an accident," she said, breath catching in her throat. There's a sound the human body makes when the ground disappears beneath it. It's not a scream. It's not a gasp. It's like your soul gets sucked out through your spine. I heard that sound come out of me. Jake had borrowed the car to pick up pizza for some stupid video game night with his friends. He took the back roads, the ones with the blind turns and no guardrails, because he liked the freedom of them. That was Jake. 17, fearless, and dumb in that beautiful teenage boy way. A truck came around the corner too fast. Jake swerved to avoid it. The car flipped. Twice. When we got to the hospital, they wouldn't let us see him right away. Stabilizing, they said. Prepping for imaging. My wife collapsed into a chair. I just stood there, gripping the back of it, like holding onto something physical could keep the whole world from slipping out of place. A nurse finally came over. Her eyes were kind, but tired. He's conscious, she said, but his legs are badly broken. Both femurs. One tibia. Internal bleeding is suspected. Is he going to be okay? I asked. She hesitated. That silence was worse than anything she could have said. She told us the orthopedic surgeon on staff wasn't specialized enough for this type of trauma. Jake needed someone with advanced reconstructive experience, someone who could operate now, before swelling made it too risky. We've called in a trauma specialist, she said. He's the best. Just moved here from Chicago. You're lucky he was on call. Lucky. I remember repeating that word in my head. Lucky. It didn't feel like luck. It felt like a punishment. Like a god I didn't believe in anymore had decided to teach me something the hard way. We waited. And waited. 30 minutes. An hour. And then the doors opened, and in walked the specialist. The man from the bank. The same gray eyes. The same calm. Only now he wasn't wearing a suit. Now he wore scrubs, and a badge that read Dr. David L. Thompson, Orthopedic Trauma. My stomach turned to concrete. His eyes scanned the room, landed on me, and for the briefest second, they flickered with something, recognition. Contempt. Pity. I didn't breathe. My wife stood up beside me and extended her hand. You must be Dr. Thompson. Thank you for coming. He shook her hand. Gently. Then turned to me. Sir, he said, with a slight nod. His tone was smooth. Professional. Ice cold. Do you remember me? I blurted out before I could stop myself. He paused. Yes, he said. That's all. Just that one word. He turned away and started reviewing Jake's chart with the nurse like I didn't even exist. Like I was a chair or a dirty tile on the floor. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to be invisible. I paced the waiting room like a caged animal. My wife tried to calm me down, but I couldn't sit still. My thoughts spiraled. What if he didn't try as hard? What if he messed up on purpose? What if he left a screw loose or shaved a few minutes off surgery time? What if I had cost my son his legs? Because of my stupid, poisonous, arrogant mouth. I couldn't stop replaying that moment in the bank. The sneer in my voice. The way I mocked him. And now this man had my son's life in his hands. There are moments in life that break you. But there are also moments that hold a mirror up so close, you can't look away. This was both. I stood in that hallway like a man on trial, only this time there was no jury and no chance to explain myself. Just Dr. Thompson. And my son. I kept trying to breathe, but it felt like someone had their hand on my throat. Every second that ticked by felt like another pound of weight on my chest. I tried sitting. Then I stood. Then I paced. I must have looked like a lunatic to the nurses, but I didn't care. All I could think about was him. My wife sat beside me, clasping her hands together, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. I envied her belief in something higher. At that moment, all I believed in was consequences. I couldn't stop thinking about how calm he'd looked. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't been humiliated by me 2 weeks ago in front of a room full of strangers. He'd remembered me. He said so. And yet, he was still here. Still doing his job. Still preparing to operate on my son. But how could I trust him? I hated myself for even thinking that. But the thought came anyway. Wouldn't I hesitate, if the roles were reversed? Wouldn't I take my time, cut corners, maybe just a little less care than usual? And then came the real question. The one that made my stomach twist. Did I deserve his best? I closed my eyes and remembered what I said to him at the bank. Jungle protocol. Treehouse in the rainforest. Like he was less than human. And now, the person I tried to make small, the one I tried to humiliate, held my son's life in his hands. My beautiful, reckless boy, who didn't know any of this. Jake wasn't a part of what I'd done. But he might pay the price anyway. The nurse came into the waiting room. Mr. and Mrs. Evans, she said, soft and steady. They're starting the procedure now. It may take several hours. Dr. Thompson wanted you to know he'll update you when it's over. I nodded but couldn't meet her eyes. As she turned away, I found myself blurting out, "He's really the best you've got." She stopped. Dr. Thompson is one of the top trauma orthopedic surgeons in the country, she said without missing a beat. He's worked in war zones. Disaster areas. Trained in Chicago. Rebuilt limbs from scratch. If your son was mine, I'd want him in that room. Then she looked at me differently. Not cruelly. Not coldly. But with something between pity and disappointment. And walked away. The hours crawled. Every time a doctor passed by, I jerked my head up, desperate for news. I scrolled my phone aimlessly. Checked headlines I didn't read. Watched the same news ticker loop again and again, like the world was still spinning while mine had stopped. My wife dozed off in the chair beside me, her fingers still wrapped around her rosary beads. And then, finally, just past midnight, the doors swung open. Dr. Thompson walked out, removing his gloves and surgical cap. His face was unreadable, calm, efficient, professional. But when his eyes met mine, I felt it again. That flicker. That cold awareness between us. He approached. "Your son is stable," he said. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. We managed to set both femurs with titanium rods. There was internal bleeding near the spleen, but we caught it early. I believe he'll make a full recovery. He'll need time. Physical therapy. Pain management. But he'll walk again. My wife burst into tears. I opened my mouth, but no words came. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to fall on my knees and beg. I wanted to say I'm sorry, I was wrong, you didn't deserve any of it. But all I managed was, "Thank you, doctor." He nodded. "I'll check on him in the morning." Then he turned and walked away. No extra words. No emotion. Just, gone. And I was left in the hallway with my son alive, my wife sobbing, and a shame so deep I swear I could feel it under my skin. That man had every reason to hate me. He had every reason to walk out of that operating room and let someone else handle it. He didn't. He chose to save my son anyway. And I knew, in that moment, I wasn't the better man. Not by a long shot. The next morning came with the weight of everything I hadn't said. Jake was alive. That truth hit me in waves. He was in pain, doped up, groggy from anesthesia, but alive. Whole. Legs intact. A future still ahead of him. And I owed all of it to the man I had tried to reduce to nothing in a bank lobby just 2 weeks before. There's something strange that happens when you're forced to rely on someone you once tried to dehumanize. Your brain can't process it. Your ego doesn't want to. You start making excuses, rewriting the past in your head, convincing yourself maybe you weren't that bad. But I knew the truth. I'd looked that man in the face and spit poison. And he'd still walked into that or and saved my kid's life. He was the only reason Jake would ever walk across a stage at graduation. The only reason he might dance at his wedding. The only reason his life hadn't ended upside down in that mangled piece of metal on the roadside. And I was too much of a coward to say a damn thing to him. When I walked into Jake's hospital room that morning, he was half awake, groggy but smiling through the haze. "Dad," he murmured, "they say I've got robot legs now. Kinda cool." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. I sat beside him, holding his hand, listening to the machines beeping softly. My wife was curled in the corner chair, asleep with a blanket over her shoulders. The storm had passed, but the wreckage was still all around us. A soft knock came at the door. I looked up. Dr. Thompson. He stepped in with his chart, calm and focused. He checked Jake's vitals, glanced at the 4 lines, then moved to the foot of the bed and gently lifted the blanket to inspect the braces on Jake's legs. "Circulation looks good," he said quietly. "We'll schedule a scan this afternoon, and if the swelling stays down, we can begin passive range of motion exercises in a few days." Jake blinked. "You're the doctor who fixed me." Dr. Thompson smiled, just a little. "I had some help." "You're a tough kid." Jake gave him a sleepy thumbs up. And then, just for a second, Dr. Thompson glanced at me. Just a flick of the eyes. No expression. No anger. No warmth either. Just a look. A moment of shared history. A silence that said everything. I wanted to speak. I wanted to stand up and say something. Anything. I was wrong. I'm sorry. You saved my son, and I don't deserve your grace. But I couldn't move. Because it wasn't just guilt that froze me. It was shame. After he left, I stared at the door for a long time. "Is he okay?" Jake asked. He seemed, kind of intense. "He's fine," I said quickly. "Just tired." I didn't know how to explain to my son that the man who saved his legs was someone I'd once degraded to nothing but a stereotype. Someone I saw not as a man, but a symbol, one I thought I could mock without consequences. Turns out, I was wrong. Later that day, Dr. Thompson returned with the scans. My wife was out getting coffee, and Jake was asleep again. This time, he didn't say anything as he stood at the window, staring at the printout in his hand. I sat stiffly in the corner, pretending to check emails on my phone, but my heart was pounding. "I knew who you were the second I walked into the ER, he said, his voice low and even. I looked up slowly. He wasn't facing me. "I didn't say anything because I don't work with revenge," he continued. "That's not my job. That's not who I am." He turned then, and our eyes locked. "But I want you to understand something. I didn't save your son for you. I didn't even do it for him. I did it because that's my calling. Because I swore an oath, and unlike some people, I take mine seriously." I swallowed hard. "I know. He held up a hand. "I don't want an apology. That would just make you feel better." He stepped closer. Calm. Direct. Deadly honest. "You humiliated me in front of a room full of people. Not just with your words, but with the assumption behind them. That I was less. That I didn't belong there." I looked down. I couldn't bear his eyes on me. "And now," he said, softer, "you owe your son's future to the man you tried to belittle. That's not irony. That's reality." Then he walked to the door, paused, and turned one last time. "Whatever you think this moment is, redemption, reckoning, justice, it's not. This isn't about you. This is about who I choose to be, even when people like you show me exactly who you are." He left. And I broke. I cried that night. I waited until my wife was asleep in the hospital pullout, until Jake was out cold, and I cried like I hadn't cried in 30 years. Not because I was afraid, or even guilty, but because I realized I had looked a good man in the face and treated him like nothing. And he saved my world anyway. What do you even do with that? How do you carry it? I didn't sleep that night. I watched the glow of the monitors next to Jake's bed and listened to the steady rhythm of his breath. In and out. Like nothing had happened. Like the world hadn't come within inches of falling apart. Like I hadn't just been handed one of the most brutal truths of my life by the man I least deserved it from. His words played in my head on a loop. This isn't about you. This is about who I choose to be. It should have ended there. It should have been enough. But something inside me couldn't let go. Not just the shame, but the realization that I had never seen this man before. Not really. Not beyond what I wanted to see. That's what racism is, right? Not just hatred. Not just slurs or symbols or tiki torches. It's the invisibility. The way we make people disappear, even when they're standing right in front of us. 2 days later, I asked to speak with him. I didn't expect him to agree. But he did. Not out of kindness, I think, but maybe out of curiosity. Or closure. We met in a small, windowless consultation room near the nurse's station. I stood awkwardly, not sure whether to sit, shake hands, or fall on my knees. He stayed standing too. Clipboard in hand. Calm, as always. I know you said you didn't want an apology, I started, my voice already cracking. But I need to say it anyway. He didn't move. I was ignorant. I was cruel. I made assumptions that weren't just wrong, they were hateful. And I didn't see it until. I gestured helplessly toward the hallway. Until my son needed you. And you showed up anyway. Still, he said nothing. I can't undo what I said. But I want to understand. I need to know how you could look at me and still walk into that door. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, but consideration. He set the clipboard down. You want to know how, he said quietly. Okay. He folded his arms, leaned slightly against the wall. And then he told me. When I was 10 years old, my father was arrested in front of me. Handcuffed on our porch for a mistaken identity. The cop pushed his face into the pavement while I screamed from the window. It took 2 days before they admitted they had the wrong guy. My chest tightened. When I was 16, I got pulled over for doing 3 miles over the limit. They made me get out. Put me on the curb. Searched the car. One officer kept his hand on his holster the whole time. He looked at me, not angrily. Just tired. Every scholarship I ever got. People assumed it was a handout. Every achievement. Affirmative action. Every patient who questioned if I was really the doctor. Every colleague who asked where I was really from. I couldn't speak. I've seen men like you my whole life. Loud or quiet. Overt or subtle. Doesn't matter. The message is the same, you don't belong here. But I stayed. I pushed through. I became someone people like you couldn't ignore. He leaned in slightly. So when I saw you in that ER, I wanted to walk away. Not because I wouldn't have been right to, but because it would have been easy. A pause. But if I had done that, I'd be letting you decide who I am. That hit me like a train. He had walked into that operating room not just to save my son, but to prove something to himself. To reclaim his own humanity in a system that constantly tried to take it away. I had become just another face in a long line of people trying to keep him small. But he refused to be small with me. He stood taller. He walked straighter. And he cut into my son's body with hands steadier than I could ever dream of having. I don't want your apology, he said again. I want you to sit with what you've done. I want you to feel it. Because feeling it is the only way anything ever changes. And then he left. And I did sit with it. That night, I sat in the dark by Jake's bedside and thought about every time I let a joke slide. Every, not like the others, comment. Every stereotype I shrugged off because it didn't hurt me. It wasn't just the bank. That moment was the explosion, but the fuel had been leaking for years. Dr. Thompson didn't need my redemption story. But I needed the fall. The next day, Jake was smiling again. A little more awake, a little more aware. He asked about school. His friends. Even cracked a joke about joining the X-Men with all his new metal parts. And I just watched him, overwhelmed. Because if Dr. Thompson hadn't been there, if he'd made a different choice, Jake would be in a wheelchair. Or worse. Because of me. Time passed, but the shame didn't. Jake stayed in the hospital for another 8 days. 8 days of bedpans, sponge baths, medication charts, and physical therapy consults. 8 days of nurses coming and going, of constant beeping and whispered prayers and meals neither of us touched. But he was healing. Each day, he sat up a little straighter. Asked more questions. Grinned more often. Even the bruises on his face had begun to fade, replaced by a fire in his eyes that said he wasn't going to let this break him. That part of him he got from his mom. And then, just like that, the talk turned to discharge. The doctors said he'd need a wheelchair for a while. Then crutches. Then, with therapy and time, he'd be walking again. Running again. Maybe not back on the football field, but on his feet. It was a miracle. No, it was him. Dr. Thompson. But I still hadn't said it. Not the way I should have. Not the way it counted. On the 6th night, my wife finally convinced me to go home for a few hours. Grab a change of clothes. Take a shower that didn't require asking a nurse for permission. I agreed, reluctantly, and left Jake watching some dumb reality show with a half-eaten cup of hospital jello in his lap. I got back a little after 11 p.m. The room was dark except for the soft blue glow from the monitor by his bed. I stepped inside quietly, trying not to wake him. You said something racist to him, didn't you? The words stopped me in my tracks. Jake was wide awake. Lying still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. What? I asked, heart seizing. He turned his head slowly toward me. Dr. Thompson, he said. I heard one of the nurses talking. Said he saved me even after what my dad said to him at a bank. I couldn't breathe. Jake didn't yell. Didn't curse. He just looked, small. Like the floor beneath him had cracked and he wasn't sure if I'd pull him up or push him through. Jake, I whispered, stepping toward the bed. I didn't mean. Don't, he said, holding up a hand. Don't do that thing where you say it was a joke, or that you were stressed, or that it was taken the wrong way. Silence. He exhaled. I don't care what you meant. I care that you did it. The words didn't come from anger. They came from disappointment. And that hurt more than anything Dr. Thompson had said. I look up to you, Dad, Jake said quietly. I always have. You taught me how to drive, how to change a tire, how to throw a spiral. His voice cracked. But I don't want to learn that from you. I stood there in the dark, feeling the weight of it all crash over me. My own son, the boy whose scraped knees I used to kiss better, whose science projects I stayed up late helping finish, was now looking at me not with admiration, but fear. Fear that who I was deep down, was smaller than he thought. I'm sorry, I finally said. Not a reflex. Not a deflection. Just the truth. I didn't see it. I didn't see him. And I didn't see how blind I was until it almost cost you everything. Jake nodded slowly. He didn't forgive me. He didn't need to. But he didn't push me away either. We sat in silence for a while. Just the two of us. Father and son. Somewhere between broken and healing. The next morning, we were getting Jake ready for his first real session with the physical therapist. There were straps and belts and instructions, and Jake was trying to act cool while hiding how nervous he was. That's when Dr. Thompson came in. "Morning," he said, setting the chart down. "Ready to try standing?" Jake grinned. "Born ready." They started slowly. Adjusting the bed. Positioning his legs. Helping him shift to the edge. The therapist on one side, Dr. Thompson on the other. "Take your time," Dr. Thompson said. "No rush." Jake took a breath. Then another. And then, with a groan and a wobble, he stood. Just for a second. But he stood. Tears hit my eyes before I could stop them. He sat back down quickly, panting, but smiling like he'd just climbed Everest. "I'll be walking in no time," he said proudly. Dr. Thompson nodded. "I don't doubt it." Then, something unexpected happened. Jake reached out his hand. "Thank you, sir," he said. "For everything." Dr. Thompson hesitated for a heartbeat. Then he took the hand, shook it firmly, and smiled. "My pleasure, Jake." And with that, he left the room. I turned to my son. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," Jake replied. "But I wanted to." Then he looked at me. "Did you ever thank him?" I stared at him. "No," I said. "Not really." Jake's eyes lingered on me a second longer, then turned back to the window. "I think you should. T's been 4 months since the accident. Jake's walking now, not perfectly, but better than anyone expected. Every step he takes is a reminder of what could have been lost. And every step is because of Dr. David Thompson. And still, I never properly thanked him. I had my chance. He visited one last time before we were discharged. Checked Jake's chart, gave him advice, then turned to leave. Our eyes met. I opened my mouth, then said nothing. Coward. Jake asked me later, "Did you thank him?" I said no. That's why I'm writing this now. Because even if he never sees it, some things need to be said out loud, especially when they come too late. Dr. Thompson, I humiliated you. I saw you as less. I treated you like you didn't belong. And yet, you saved my son. You didn't do it for me. You didn't even do it for Jake. You did it because you're the kind of man who shows up when it matters. You said you didn't want an apology. But I'm giving one anyway. I'm sorry. For the words at the bank. For the decades of people like me doing what I did without consequence. For only seeing what I wanted to see. And I thank you. For choosing mercy. For saving what matters most to me. For being bigger than my ignorance. To anyone reading this, especially if you look like me, know this. Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides in jokes, in silence, in shrugs. It lives in us, whether we see it or not. And one day, if you're lucky, someone you wronged will choose to save you anyway. Not because you deserve it. But because they do. I'm trying to be better. Not for forgiveness. For my son. And maybe, one day, for myself. T's been 4 months since the accident. Jake's walking now, not perfectly, but better than anyone expected. Every step he takes is a reminder of what could have been lost. And every step is because of Dr. David Thompson. And still, I never properly thanked him. I had my chance. He visited one last time before we were discharged. Checked Jake's chart, gave him advice, then turned to leave. Our eyes met. I opened my mouth, then said nothing. Coward. Jake asked me later, did you thank him? I said no. That's why I'm writing this now. Because even if he never sees it, some things need to be said out loud, especially when they come too late. Dr. Thompson, I humiliated you. I saw you as less. I treated you like you didn't belong. And yet, you saved my son. You didn't do it for me. You didn't even do it for Jake. You did it because you're the kind of man who shows up when it matters. You said you didn't want an apology. But I'm giving one anyway. I'm sorry. For the words at the bank. For the decades of people like me doing what I did without consequence. For only seeing what I wanted to see. And I thank you. For choosing mercy. For saving what matters most to me. For being bigger than my ignorance. To anyone reading this, especially if you look like me, know this. Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides in jokes, in silence, in shrugs. It lives in us, whether we see it or not. And one day, if you're lucky, someone you wronged will choose to save you anyway. Not because you deserve it. But because they do. I'm trying to be better. Not for forgiveness. For my son. And maybe, one day, for myself.